Hello, everybody, and welcome back to English 2367. This is K-Swizzle checking in for my week 3 focus lecture, which this week is titled To Be in Conversation, Social Mediated Solidarities Between Creator and Audience. Now, of course, we're going to really be thinking about the interplay between how the medium selected by a creator is going to shape the audience's engagement with the content of their work. But I also want us to think about how the choices that a creator makes in terms of where they post their content is also going to be shaped by other aspects such as the algorithm, the user interface, and other digital tools and things that we've talked about kind of from week 2 onwards, if you'll recall. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about our agenda for this week. So on the agenda, we've got 3 sections. We've got recapping rhetoric, foundations of effective argumentation. Here is where I'm going to be really thinking about the ways that the textbook excerpt for this week is giving us some useful ways of approaching effective argumentation, not only in terms of sort of big picture details, but also helping us to start to notice and focus in on some of the strategies used by a rhetor when conveying an argument or message to their audience. We're going to move from recapping rhetoric into a day in the life, mediating personal narrative through comics. And this is where I'm going to really focus on the text for this week that focus on comic book storytelling. Specifically, I'm going to kind of break this section into 2 parts. First, with scholarship snapshot on comics and zines, and the second will be comics as primary sources for week 3. You'll notice that in the scholarship snapshot portion, I'm going to give you some secondary source context that is not assigned for this week and pair that with what you did read for this week, specifically the K-Swizzle article. Reason being that when it comes to comic book storytelling, there's some key concepts and also just some larger historical things that I want us to be attentive to when we're engaging with the works that we are for this week, to make sure that you've got a more well-rounded sense of some of the ways in which the medium of comics, and also quite simply just the different kind of creative approaches that are taken with comics, can be really at the forefront of our mind. And then with comics as primary sources for week 3, that's where I'm going to really kind of talk about some of the particularities of how the creators whose work we looked at for this week are using some of these strategies and whose work can be applicable or to some of these, or relevant to some of these key concepts. And then finally, we'll talk about mediated representations of incarceration or life narratives in podcasting. And this will be where we talk about the episodes from Ear Hustle that you listened to for this week. And so whether you want to listen to this lecture straight through or you want to break it up into sections, whichever approach is most conducive for you to complete it in full, I am totally supportive of. So let's start with recapping rhetoric, or thinking about foundations of effective argumentation. Now, 2 terms that you're going to hear me use throughout the semester and that you yourself will also be utilizing in the second half of the semester is primary source and secondary source. And these are terms that I want to make sure that we have a really firm grasp on, because they're terms that are not only going to be, of course, embedded in the scheduled assignments, as you've already seen, as kind of descriptors for the types of works that you're looking at, but they're also going to be really important to be clear on when it gets to preparing your final project and thinking about what analytical approach you're taking with your final project in terms of the content that you're focusing on and the argumentative lens that you choose to approach it with. So when we talk about primary sources, a primary source is a text in which a creator presents a message or argument about an issue, experience, event, concept, or ideology. The creator represents their message or argument in a format that the creator's audience can engage with through participatory activities like reading, viewing, clicking or swiping, sharing to another platform, or listening. And so when we think about a primary source, I want us to really notice and observe that a primary source is going to be a text where a writer or a content creator in some capacity is making a point about something, right? They're communicating something to an audience of some kind. And so some of these arguments or these messages that are being conveyed might be rather low stakes. If we think back to even the examples of argumentative claims that I gave last week, I'm thinking about, the sky is blue as being a statement of fact as opposed to an argumentative claim. But in some cases, the message or argument conveyed through a primary source might be a higher stakes one, right? Whether it's politically leaning, social justice focused, related to a creator's personal experience, whatever it might be. A primary source is going to really be understood as a text where a creator is presenting a message of some kind to their audience that's going to really allow that audience to engage with it in some way. And so for our purposes, we want to consider how modes of engagement might consist of reading, viewing, clicking or swiping, sharing, listening, and so on. right? Now you might be thinking, why does this matter? Or why do we need to be attentive to this quality of a primary source? Well, for our purposes, we want to notice the fact that in doing this work of creating a primary source where an audience can engage with the topical focus and argumentative focus of this text in some way, the author is creating a critical space in which the contents of their text can do any of the following. It can entertain, expose a problem, bring awareness to an issue, represent a group or identity that may often be erased, overlooked, or stereotyped, or it may generate a call to action for the audience, or it might be doing one or more of these things all at the same time, right? And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. There's other things that a primary source can accomplish, but these are some key takeaways that we can really notice about what a primary source is able to do. So when we're talking about entertain, right, we're noticing the ways in which a primary source might be communicating a message that's more so meant to make the audience laugh or perhaps be distracted from their daily life or the 24-hour news cycle, or is rather low stakes in the sense that it's meant to maybe hold your attention for purposes other than doing something a bit more scaffolded, right? There are, of course, exceptions to this as well. But for now, we can kind of think about it as sometimes an author or a creator is developing a critical space where the purpose of it is that you feel some sense of enjoyment. Expose a problem. This might be something that relates to structural inequities. It could relate to something that is more immediate to the creator's own environment. We can think of an example like in local politics. Perhaps they have an issue with a particular politician, or there's something that is up for, potential adaptation in a particular area that could be harmful to, the constituents in that region, right, or that local area, et cetera, et cetera. But expose a problem might be reflecting kind of a creator's interest in doing some kind of short-term or long-term advocacy or kind of public awareness to move the public's opinion in a certain direction. Bring awareness to an issue, very similarly, could also be like exposing a problem, be an example in which a creator is using their primary source to educate the public. Depending on what the issue is, with bringing awareness as opposed to exposing a problem, it may or may not have a deliverable associated with it. So oftentimes when a creator is developing a primary source associated with exposing a problem, there may be some kind of call to action or some sort of next step related to it, right? Like call your local representatives or call your senator or write this or do this or sign this petition. With bringing awareness to an issue, sometimes it's more so a matter of educating the public on something that perhaps was misrepresented in a textbook that they engaged with when they were younger. Or perhaps it's a matter of educating the public on something that's growing over time, like climate change, right? But oftentimes with bringing awareness to an issue, and there can be exceptions to this, but most often with primary sources in this regard, the bringing awareness is more so about sort of changing public opinion over time, as opposed to the immediacy of exposing a problem. Represent a group or identity that may often be erased, overlooked, or stereotyped. I hope that this feels very pertinent to weeks 1 and 2, which is what we've of course really focused on with the text for that week. But primary sources that do this kind of work are really acting as a kind of, in some respects, bringing awareness to an issue, but more specifically are oftentimes looking at particular examples of, some kind of issue that's most relevant to a particular group, right? Oftentimes a marginalized group of some kind, and is really providing some examples of here's the kind of perhaps representations that we don't want to see. And they may connect that then with examples of what could be a useful replacement for or alternative to this. So for example, in thinking back to some of the videos that we watched in week 1 related to Asian American and Pacific Islander representation in US media, right? The videos that we looked at as primary sources really offered some core examples of here's how, in terms of the film industry or the television industry in the US, Asian American and Pacific Islander characters have been written, right? And so they're giving us examples of what does it mean to say that a group like AAPI communities have been erased, overlooked, or stereotyped? And then beyond that, they kind of talk about what are some frameworks or examples of ways that we can look beyond those types of representations that enact harm and instead consider what it would mean to actually, represent AAPI communities in nuanced ways. Okay, and then generate a call to action for the audience. Sometimes this is an isolated focus for a primary source, right? Instead of perhaps leading with other points of entry, like exposing a problem. Sometimes a primary source gets right to the point of saying, this is something I'd like for you to do, or the next steps that I'd like you to do. Sometimes a call to action can also materialize in the form of like a mutual aid request, or sometimes can be most effective when situated within the breadth of work of a creator who's established an audience that's familiar with knowing these calls to action are being put out to the audience. So for example, a climate change activist group perhaps may have calls to action that are more immediate in terms of the post itself, because they've already curated an audience that's attentive to and aware of the fact that the content that they're getting from this source is going to generally lean in that direction, right? There's some kind of precedent or expectation established. And so really what I'm getting at here is, with a primary source, we're paying attention to a creator or multiple creators create a thing, that thing creates meaning, and that meaning is interpreted by the audience in ways that ideally move them in the direction of being compelled to accept the argument or message conveyed by that primary source. Now, secondary sources are going to be a little bit different. And sometimes the difference between a primary or secondary source is going to rely on how are you using a text, right? So in some contexts, a source of some kind might work as a primary source, and in other situations might work as a secondary source. But for now, we're going to kind of keep them different from each other in more demarcated ways. So a secondary source is going to be a text that we're using to supplement our reading of or our engagement with a primary source. Now, I'm a little bit of a hater when it comes to the OSU English textbooks sometimes, but I do think that the OSU English 1110 textbook does a good job of explaining secondary sources in a succinct way. And so you'll notice that I've pulled from that, even though it's not our textbook for this semester. So they describe secondary sources as being a secondary source of ideas and information. This text is used to inform, question, and shape your thoughts about your primary source. And I really like that descriptor, because what it gets at is, what are the actions taken with a secondary source that are going to allow you to, or enable you to, enhance your understanding of and analysis of that primary source that you're working with. If you think about our highlight reel assignment, that's really what we're doing, right? I'm asking you to select a secondary source from the week that's allowing you to enhance your comprehension or, engagement of and with the primary sources in some sort of meaningful way. And in doing so is helping you to advance perhaps your own applications of a particular concept, are assisting you in identifying or understanding something of note in the primary sources, right? You're utilizing that secondary source as sort of a boost up. It's almost like, if the primary source is like the counter, the secondary source is the stepping stool that helps you reach that counter a little bit more efficiently. And so a secondary source, according to the English 1110 textbook, is a written text. I do push back on that. I'll say why in a second, but they describe it or define it as a written text, such as academic papers, magazine or newspaper articles, essays, or chapters from books that examine objects, data, or phenomena and make analytical claims about them. You don't necessarily have to have a secondary source that's a written text. In some cases, it might be a video interview. In some cases, it might be, a series of infographics that perhaps are adaptations of a written text in some manner, right? There's a lot of different things that could act as a secondary source. So we're going to trouble that a little bit, but kind of the general idea presented here of that the secondary source is a text that examines objects, data, or phenomena and make analytical claims about them is what's most useful to us, right? Because there's something about what's in the secondary source, whether it's, if we think back to even the Asian American and Pacific Islanders on TV article, if you'll notice some of my comments on your highlight reels were things like, what statistics stood out to you? What core examples did they provide? What is the origin point of the data that they're referencing, right? What are some of the ways that their approach to this topic is going to give us some useful frameworks for approaching the topical and argumentative focus offered by the primary sources. And so I provide here towards the bottom of the screen that other types of secondary sources, if we wanted to think outside of the realm of a written text, right? Yes, of course, we can think of a written or verbal interview with the creator or creators of a text, but we can also think about other options such as creator panels from comics expos, conferences, and virtual events, video essays and commentary posted to YouTube or TikTok, and documentaries or docu-series. The one thing I want us to really be thinking about, though, when it comes to a secondary source is that credentials are really important to factor in when considering who or what you would like to cite in an argument to enhance your own credibility. So by credibility, I mean what provides the person who's speaking on the topic with kind of a reasonable authority upon which they can talk on this topic, right? Did they go to school for this thing? Do they have life experience? Do they have professional experience? Do they have any number of, experiences or just kind of professional trainings that are going to allow them to have a more expert opinion on or expert assessment of what it is that they're talking about in that secondary source, right? And so important to us in the second part of the semester will be, how do we assess a credible secondary source? And how does the credibility of a source depend in part on not only where it's published and who it's published by, but also the credentials of the person or the people who are authoring it in the first place? Now, in terms of how this relates to the reading for this week from So What, there are just a couple of things I wanted to hit on quite briefly, but I wanted to note that their discussion of an everyday argument is a good section to pay attention to for this week. So last week, they gave us the really good kind of visual of thinking about how when we create an argument, we want to build an argument as a type of bridge or structure that then the claims are supporting, and that the rationales are also helping to allow for this argumentative bridge to remain intact. This week, when we're thinking about argumentation, they give us this really useful point of effective arguments always build on some basis of acceptance or agreement. And they kind of give us a few different examples that I think kind of help to illustrate this point. But I want us to kind of keep this in mind, that you'll see kind of from the example that they provide below, and as they say, as we can see from the dialogue in the example that they provide, the argument only works if the boss accepts the reasons provided. And so we want to consider how, when we're writing to or engaging a particular audience, some of the ways that our claims can only advance efficiently or effectively is if the audience ultimately moves with your logical points that you're making towards your conclusion, right? Otherwise, you have a resistant reader who isn't perhaps in the best position to actually kind of move with you from one point to the next because they don't see how those points correlate. And so sometimes in the feedback that I provide on your writing, you'll see that I'll make points about, how does this sentence transition into the next, or how does this point relate to this next point that you're making? Because we want to really consider that an effective argument is going to really curate an experience in which the audience is able to see how things are logically connecting to each other. And especially, how are you advancing an argumentative claim that you're then well supporting with evidence or examples that can really demonstrate how you're arriving at the argumentative claim that you are, right? And then that will really allow for the basis of acceptance or agreement to be upheld properly. I also really like this visual that they provide on kind of the following page, where they talk about, they take the original argument that they use as an example and they reinterpret it into a graphic format that highlights how its structure can unfold. And so they show, I deserve a raise because, and so that's going to be sort of your primary point that's being communicated. And then they demonstrate how I'm hardworking, I'm indispensable, and I'm underpaid are sort of the supporting points that then help to ultimately round out or build out the I guess kind of not only believability, but also the sort of persuasiveness of that original point that's advanced by the person in the example, right? And you'll see that they then kind of expand on that in the second example with the reasons of I deserve a raise because, and on the left side of the screen, we see I'm hardworking, as you already agree, or I'm indispensable because I have more experience than others, or I'm a good problem solver. I deserve a raise because I'm underpaid because other employees have offered me more money, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So the point here is that the way that they're mapping out the kind of logical advancement of this argument is helping us to see how in this example, the communication is really relying on following through on the initial point that you make. And you'll see me oftentimes in your writing make points about, this is really effective or good follow through, or perhaps I want to see you follow through on this point a little bit more. So it sort of reaches a satisfying conclusion or point for your reader. Here's where we're going to transition into a day in the life, mediating personal narrative through comics. I'm going to pause just to get some water, and then I will come right back. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into a day in the life, mediating personal narrative through comics. And as I mentioned in my beginning of my lecture, I broke this section into two smaller parts, in part to differentiate between what I'm covering in each section, but also because I felt that this would sort of be a good way to indicate for you how we're moving between secondary sources that provide that kind of, analytical lens that I talked about in the last section, but also to then draw some points of connection between this historical context and to kind of talk then about what you actually looked at for this week. So let's go ahead and begin with thinking about a scholarship snapshot on comics and zines. Now, Hilary Chute, who's a really influential and important comic studies scholar, writes in Why Comics from Underground to Everywhere that comics is mistaken as only being a superhero genre. And she kind of points out that comics, on the other hand, is a medium in its own right, not a lowbrow genre of either art or literature as it is sometimes understood, and it can be about anything. She notes that in the 1940s and 1950s, comics were perceived of as a loose and dangerous form of youth culture that sort of members of the government and just kind of the political elite were really concerned were polluting children's brains with bad ideas. And so much of our contemporary attitudes towards comics unfortunately retain the very negative view of comics that existed in the 20th century. And there continues to be the stigma associated with them as if comics are a location or medium in which, you only have ideas that are not worthy of study or discussion or coverage in other genres or mediums, which is not true. And you also have kind of this false interpretation often promoted that comics are only for children, which is not, in fact, the case. And some of our purpose for this week will be to really challenge that notion that unfortunately persists, that comics are somehow amateurish in nature, not rigorous enough to be considered worthy of academic inquiry, but also, again, this misperception that comics are only about superheroes when there are many comics that focus on topics and characters that extend beyond the superhero genre, despite the fact that the superhero genre, of course, is a very profitable and popular one when it comes to comics. And she also kind of provides, Hilary Chute, some kind of background information that we first get newspaper comic strips in the 1890s and onwards. We then see the advent of comic books in the 1930s, and then we really see the graphic novel rise in the 1970s. And so then we see kind of a more broadened way in which comic storytelling exists in different formats, depending on kind of the type of paper that it's printed on, the publisher that is, funding it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to include this to really note the fact that we've had comic storytelling since the late 19th century, and it continues to be a popular and profitable form of storytelling in the 21st century. But we can really see how the evolutions from the newspaper comic strip to the comic book to the graphic novel to our now transmedial storytelling of this current moment really provide so many different points of entry for creators to tell their own stories and tell stories for larger publishers. Now, Chute also notes in the introduction to Why Comics that cartoons are often equated with funny drawings, right? And this idea that cartoons are silly or, again, amateurish, much like kind of comic books in a more quote unquote formal capacity when they're bound together as comic books or graphic novels. She points to the fact that standalone comic books began in the late 1920s as a way for publishers to reprint their newspaper comic strips. And so whereas initially you have newspaper comic strips interpreted as sort of disposable because they're of course printed on, a daily or a weekly newspaper that then kind of gets thrown away, recycled, or used in other capacities. She notes the industry shifts of seeing comic strips be kind of published into collections or comic books really changed some of the public's approach to understanding these as kind of important modes of storytelling. She also notes that in 1938, Superman inaugurates the golden age of comic books, and of course, arguably continues to be one of sort of the pinnacles of comic book storytelling that then lend to part of the reason that, public perception for folks who don't read comics is that superheroes really encapsulate the entirety of comics. In 1939, we also get Batman, and in 1941, we get Captain America. And in 1954, even though these, beloved characters, of course, are really advancing comic books in terms of there being a really popular kind of presence in US pop culture and also sort of a growing readership and audience for these characters and these stories. In 1954 is really when the allegations of juvenile delinquency start to take place, or again, this idea that comics are polluting the public's mind, and specifically this idea from political elites that you should get comic books out of the hands of children because they are being swayed to be more likely to commit violence or are more likely to be, kind of not willing to listen to authority and grow up in society in the ways that they should because of what they're reading in comics. Not all too different from what we see in terms of contemporary discourse on warnings about video games. And so in the 1960s, we get the Silver Age with Stan Lee and the MCU, or Marvel Cinematic Universe, which of course, if you're a person who lives and breathes in the world, you've definitely heard of the MCU or are a fan of it, even if you were not engaged with it in any capacity. Of course, I think it's sort of common knowledge that this really dominates so much of kind of media culture, both in a national and international context. We don't have enough time to get into kind of that contribution to comic books and pop culture, but I did want to pinpoint some of these really important industry shifts in comics, just because we can really see how they continue to have some impact today. In the 1960s and 1970s, we have the kind of shift towards underground comics, where you have independent creators who are not sort of working for one of the big two, being DC or Marvel, as they are now known, right? We see really underground comics creators starting to move comics in a different direction from, thinking about sort of what publishing houses and presses are really pushing for creators to contribute to. And we really see the beginning of comics autobiography in 1972, or the point at which independent creators start to use the comics medium as a way to tell, memoirs and autobiography and stories about oneself that again kind of lend to this slice of life approach, or this idea that someone can tell stories that are smaller or perhaps, spanning across their entire life by way of using the comics medium. And so we see then that comics are remade for adults in this underground, that even though comics were not intended to exclusively be for children in the first half of the 20th century, we can really see how by the latter half of the 20th century, there's more of an understanding in the underground scene that through comics, folks are able to tell their own stories without having to go through a publisher or a press that's going to have more restrictive terms upon which a story can be told. In 1978, we get the first self-proclaimed graphic novel, the title emphasizing literary qualities or long-form narrative comics. And so this shift towards kind of seeing the term graphic novel being used, whereas some folks might assume, okay, with the word graphic in there, it must mean that it's really explicit or has really kind of shocking content in them. Instead, we see the term being used as a way to kind of try to, in some capacities, challenge the existing anti-comics landscape of the 20th century and instead imply that graphic novels, or comics oftentimes longer form and a higher page count, right, are sort of just as serious or robust as text only literary projects such as the standard prose novel. And so you see a way in which kind of authors attempt to sort of rebrand, if you will, comics from being interpreted as disposable or meaningless or childish into being serious literary projects by adding the term novel to it. There's problems with that, of course, but unfortunately those debates kind of still continue today of, is a graphic novel more, important or significant of a contribution than a comic book or a comic strip? I have my feelings on that. You may have your feelings on that, but it's worthwhile to know these things as we move forward for this week. We also get kind of insight of, much like in film studies, this idea that some comic book industry folks and creators begin to think of authors as auteurs, or describing this kind of singular artistic vision of creator. Again, oftentimes this is a term used in film for folks like Orson Welles or Quentin Tarantino, oftentimes white dudes who put together films that then become interpreted as sort of, significant milestones in the industry and just kind of ways that creators think about telling a story. But in comics, unfortunately, this is also a very pervasive approach as well of interpreting that a singular creator, oftentimes a white man, is somehow kind of blessed with this sort of gifted insight into how to create a graphic novel or a comic that's going to be sort of really important to pay attention to more so than other creators. Sometimes some of the problems that come along with upholding an auteur theory or auteur approach or perspective is the idea then that some directors or comics creators get upheld as more gifted or important or more significant contributors than folks who are perhaps in the underground or independent scenes. And so we do want to kind of resist that, even as we understand and notice historically how some of their contributions are important to how the industry kind of moves from that point onward. right? And then, of course, as I already have kind of briefly mentioned, we have DC and Marvel is really our big two of comics publishing. DC is formed in 1934, and we get Marvel in 1939. And of course, we are well aware that they continue to really battle with their properties and trying to be the supreme. And we all, or at least I feel, know that DC struggles to keep up. But again, a thought for another time. But all of this is to say, Hilary Chu is really giving us some important historical context on why comics that we don't have time to read independently this go around, but I want you to be aware of. And especially a term that she offers that will be so important for our purposes this week is the term all at onceness. And by all at onceness, she's really getting at the way that comics as a medium allows for the eye to kind of take in the page as a whole all at once, even before you've actually looked at every panel or every detail on the page, right? It's sort of that experience of when you're looking at a comic, because it's a visual medium, you turn the page and your eye kind of starts to take in the page as a whole or all at once before you've even started moving your eye across the page. And she points to the fact that we don't have that experience when we're watching film or we're watching television. And therefore, the way that comics as a medium operates is moving and kind of acting differently than the types of affordances that we would get in other mediums. And therefore, we as an audience or a reader need to be attentive to that and consider how that kind of opportunity and also perhaps a restriction of all at onceness really creates a situation in which the reader is starting to be aware of what's to come by way of how the page is set up, even before they move to that narratively in terms of their eye moving across the page. And so here she really expands on these points. And I highlighted some sections that I think are most important for us in terms of understanding how we actually go about the process of reading comics. And so Chute writes, comics, on the other hand, is a medium in its own right, not a lowbrow genre of either art or literature, as it is sometimes understood, and it can be about anything. And this is an expansion on a previous quote I kind of excerpted on a previous slide. She also says, comics is not an illustrative form in which the words and images match, but rather one that Marjane Satrapi has called narrative drawing, and Art Spiegelman has called picture writing, in which the words and the images each move the narrative forward in different ways the reader creates out of the relationship between the two. So by this, what I really want us to emphasize or kind of take away here is that similarly to with your highlight reels, you don't necessarily want whatever visual detail that you use to just reiterate what's in the writing, right? With comics, you really want to be thinking about how you don't necessarily want the word and image to be repetitive or kind of redundant in that they're saying the exact same thing, but instead that they're each contributing something unique that then coalesce together to form a more enhanced or robust narrative storytelling experience, right? So the process of us looking at the page in terms of the images that are shown through the comics are then going to be sort of enhanced by the process of reading the narration boxes or speech bubbles that also supplement what we see there. And I'll kind of expand on this in a few minutes. She also mentions that in the encounter with the gutter, we see how comics gestures conspicuously to the reader's active and involved reading. And so the gutter is going to be the space that we see in between comics panels, which I'll show some examples of, that are really going to be the space where the reader has an opportunity to connect the dots or make meaning of what's happening from one panel to the next. And so comics in a lot of ways then is expecting the reader to do more work than just stare at the page and be told what's happening. She also says, in the vocabulary of the comics, the other key element aside from the gutter is the panel, also known as the frame. Comics shapes time by arranging it in space on the page in panels, which are essentially boxes of time. And so the squares that we see, or in some cases other shapes like rectangles or stars, right, that are going to really form those comic panels are going to be as important to pay attention to as what's happening within them, because they're going to shape or spatialize how time is happening for us as a reader. In some ways, this is also similar to kind of in film studies when we think about the way that the camera is mediating space between the viewer and the viewed. And what we see within the frame of the camera is also, of course, going to give us an opportunity to either forecast what's to come or remain within the moment that's immediately happening in the narrative. Chute then also says, panels are also how the cartoonist gets to experiment with directions of reading. Comics does not propose linear reading in the same way prose does. So if you'll notice, up until now, I've been talking about the fact that our reading process with comics is about the eye moving across the page. What Chute is really getting at here, though, is that because we have this all-at-onceness of the comics page, there's the potential that you might look ahead or kind of glance elsewhere before you move to that top left space on the page. And therefore, you might kind of engage with different aspects of the narrative out of order, if you will, than if you were perhaps reading a prose novel where your only option is to read from left to right and from the start of the sentence to the end of it. And so here are some examples that can be kind of helpful to visualize some of what Chu is talking about. So these are examples of 3-panel and 4-panel comics, as well as a single panel comic. So if we look to the left side of the screen of the single panel comic that comes from the Peanuts, you'll see that there is, of course, only one box, or, kind of one box where meaning or narrative action is taking place, right? So you have the little Woodstock guys on the left, and you have kind of just the speech bubble that's above them. If I can show you with my cursor, and we have like one little question mark. And then you got Snoopy on the right side, and in his thought bubble, it says, "No, I don't think you guys are cut out to pull Santa's sleigh." And so then you'll see, of course, at the bottom of this panel, it says November 28th, 27 shopping days to Christmas. Now, something I want to flag here is that with a single panel comic such as this one, which at times is more kind of familiar to us by way of the comic strip format in newspapers, you'll notice that one of the opportunities that's created through a single panel comic is that you're able to convey meaning or tell a story through the visual and the verbal details, right? So you have the visual details of, Snoopy interacting with the little Woodstock guys right here. And you have the verbal details in terms of the speech bubble and the thought bubble, and then kind of the text that's paratextual to it below it, right? Or in some ways almost acts as a caption. However, one of the restrictions of a single panel comic is, of course, that you only have one panel in which you can advance the narrative forward, which means that the constraints that are placed on the creator is that they need to be sure that the narrative that they are producing is conducive to a single panel, and that the audience can get what the meaning is without having to rely on another panel that does not exist in this capacity, right? So a story that's told through a single panel comic is going to really need to be something that's perhaps like a really easily got joke, right? Or a story that's going to be pretty simple or straightforward, that you have like whatever like chuckle or takeaway that you need right away, and doesn't rely on there needing to be more space that isn't there narratively. By contrast, if we look at the 3-panel and 4-panel comics that are on the right side of the screen from Calvin and Hobbes, we can see where the narrative is able to advance because it has more narrative room to advance, right? So for example, you're able to really kind of create dialogue that can build or is scaffolded because of the fact that you do have more space to really play around with speech bubbles, to really kind of change perspective in terms of where, if we imagine that there's a camera, kind of like in film, to like where that camera can kind of move to, or that characters can really move within or between those frames. And also that we're really able to see the progression of a narrative differently than what is possible in a single panel comic, where we don't have that same kind of action or movement that's possible. Something that's also important to comic storytelling is the splash page, or the location in a comic text where it's going to sort of comprise the entirety of one page, and you're not necessarily going to see comic panels like we saw on the previous screen. So to go back for a moment, you'll notice that the gutter, or kind of the space in between each of these panels, right, is going to be the space that Hilary Chu was talking about, where the reader is expected to connect the dots or understand the logical points of connection from point A to point B, right? And so where we have to understand, for example, or recognize that a conversation is taking place, an action is occurring, et cetera, et cetera. With a splash page, it's different because we don't have panels that are doing that connecting or inviting us to do that connecting of the dots process. Instead, with a splash page, you can almost think about it as a kind of visual punctuation, in the sense that an event or situation that's especially important to the narrative is going to be really emphasized or punctuated by a splash page in which the creators are really blowing it up to be much larger than any of the other panels or sections that we get prior to this. And oftentimes it also creates an opportunity where narration boxes or dialogue can really be focused on, because our eyes are being directed to less text on the page. So I have some examples here from the comic Lady Killer, as well as Blackbird and Nancy Drew. And in each case, we can see that an action is taking place, or an exchange is taking place, and the narration boxes that are shown here are able to really be focused on with our eyes, because there's less going on the page in terms of verbal exchange between characters, or just even the pages are less congested. And instead, the scene is kind of blown up into larger view for us. And that's some of the affordance then of a splash page, But as we were just looking at with kind of 3 or 4 or even single panel comics, right, you don't necessarily have a splash page as an opportunity or a tool that you could use in those kinds of, comic strips formats. Instead, you can really use a splash page for a long form work such as a graphic novel or a comic book where you have multiple pages to work off of. So depending on the length of your project, right, you as a creator then are going to have different opportunities to really punctuate or emphasize points that you want the reader to be attentive to. And so this gets us to a few important tools that I want us to kind of keep in our back pocket for this week. And so these come to us from Frederick Luis Aldama's Latinx Superheroes in Mainstream Comics, where he offers some terms that I think are really beneficial as building blocks of understanding how we read comics. So he talks about the process in which the reader has to make sense of the story world. And he really kind of offers these terms of geometrizing and storyfying. And so he starts with kind of in this excerpt that we're drawing from, in other words, the skillful use of geometric shapes, circles, triangles, and rectangles, along with perspective, adding a sense of weight and volume, for instance, can turn 2D lines on a page into a 3D experience in our minds. So the way that the comic is drawn and the dimension that's afforded to the comic by way of the use of purposeful shaping, right, is going to create a kind of more robust and even just kind of panoramic experience for us as a reader. He goes on to say, the geometrizing of the story doesn't end with shapes given to figures. There are the shapes given to the panels and their layout that guide the pacing of the story proper and our reading and our meaning-making processes. Visuals created in the specific sequencing of panels tells us much about the story world and its characters. So if you look on the right side of the screen, which is an excerpt from a comic by Miguel C. Hernandez, you can see that we have panels that are rectangular as opposed to square-shaped. And in these rectangular panels, right, we're really seeing kind of how the way that the story world is shaped in terms of the buildings, the character design, the various kind of objects that we have within each of these frames are drawn in such a way that it's advancing the story forward, but also is giving us different ways of understanding the cityscape and ultimately the story world that this character is moving within. Now, 2 terms, like I mentioned, that Aldama gives us that are going to be beneficial for thinking about this in more detail are geometrizing and storyfying. And so geometrizing or geometric shaping is the skillful and willful visualizing, geometrizing, of character, theme, and plot that guides our gap-filling processes and shapes our experience of a given comic book. It's the visuals that primarily drive our co-creative insertion into a story world. The shape, color, and posture guide how we make sense of the character, how we understand the character to be in the world. And the geometrizing of other elements in the story world, such as the written text, can allow us to experience their physicality. So what does he mean by this? What he's getting at is that geometrizing is going to be a concept that we can apply to describe or understand or analyze the way that a character is shaped on the page, right? In terms of their character design and how they move is going to help us understand things about the character. Kind of like in film studies where things like costuming and makeup and casting is going to inform how we make certain assumptions or derive meaning from a particular character, right? With comic books, we're really relying on the physicality of how the character runs. How do they dress? How is their body shaped? How does their hair flow? How do they move when they're interacting with other characters, right? How do they maybe talk with their hands like I do? Do they stand totally still, right? All of these different details then that are going to help us to derive meaning about and meaning from who these characters are, in that they're giving us some kinds of embodiment and body language insight that we rely on in our day-to-day lives with real people to gain a sense of who a person is, right? And so he says, once again, the shape, color, and posture are really helping us to guide and understand how we make sense of the character. So if we look at sort of the example at the top, right, we can see kind of the stature of Peppermint Patty. We can see the way that her arms are moving. We can also see kind of the geometrizing of the word behind her of saying pound, right? And just kind of how the movement of her body in interaction with another character is helping us understand that she's angry, she's flustered, she's upset, right? And very similarly in the example below from Blackbird, we can see how the character of Nina is in a state of shock or surprise. And in both cases, right, we don't necessarily have access to the full narrative since I've only pulled these 2 panels, but just based on their physicality alone, we can make some kind of reasonable guesses as to what's going on at this point in their story, right? And it's allowing us to really understand something about them as characters. Now, Storyfy or Storyfying is going to refer to the verbal elements that allow the creator or creators to provide insight into any given character. They allow the creator to invest a character with nuanced thoughts and feelings. The verbal elements provide the reader with a compass direction for more nuanced evaluation of character than might be present if only the visual shaping devices were used. So this includes narrator boxes, dialogues, and thoughts of characters. Other aspects of the verbal subsystem are the names of characters, and for superheroes, the names of their alter egos, how many languages are used in the narrative, for example, are they bilingual or multilingual, and the narrator. So for contrast, if we know that geometrizing is the process of how you shape the character, or also how you shape other details such as the kind of word pound in the background that's supplementing or emphasizing the action that is being done by the character, or yow, where we get this kind of variation of speech that's not contained in the speech bubble. Storyfying is going to be about those verbal elements that are supplementing the visual elements of comics and give us more insight into what's going on narratively, and also help us get more insight about the character themselves. So whereas geometrizing is going to help us understand, how does this character move? What do they look like? What are they doing? What are the kind of physical actions that are being taken to kind of move forward in the story? Storyfying is going to be about what are other ways that the story is personalized in terms of how are the characters named? What languages do they speak? Do they speak at all, right? How much does their speech bubble or what they're saying fill up with text compared to another character's speech bubble? Do they have thought bubbles that show up and indicate what they're thinking when they're not speaking to us? Do we have narration boxes that are giving us insight into the story that's not communicated directly by the characters, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And so we can then understand, based on these terms of geometrizing and storyfying, that what we're really looking at with comics storytelling is a visual and verbal narrative that relies on both of these components to be able to communicate meaning. I've provided an example here of kind of looking at the process of developing and drawing covers. This is an independent watch that you can do if you're interested of looking at kind of an artist draw, like just covers for superhero comics, if you're interested in kind of seeing some examples beyond the terms that are offered in this lecture. Oops. And then I also provided this video of drawing portraits with Robert Lou Trujillo, of thinking about what this kind of term of geometrizing would look like in application to portraits. I think that this video does a really nice job of showing what some of those shapes that form the basis of comic storytelling look like before they're added into a larger kind of visual landscape. And so I really encourage you to look at both of these videos as some samples of some of the terms that we're talking about in actual practical application. Okay. Another term that we want to talk about is co-creation, which has come up a little bit already. But Aldama writes that because of our capacity for active co-creation, we are not bound to the comic in determinative ways. We aren't sponges that passively absorb superheroes that don't look or act like us. Maybe the superhero is older, white, straight, and male. This doesn't mean that those of us who don't identify within these categories can't co-create such a figure as our own. As our attention moves back and forth between the reading elements, verbal, and the drawn elements, visual, we perceive, interpret, and feel in a loosely guided way. And in doing so, we fill in the gaps with our own experiences and identities. We make it our own. So this term co-creation then is going to describe the ways in which a reader makes meaning or derives meaning from a text that they're engaging with outside of what is just sort of the intended meaning of the text, right? So whether that's from a fandom perspective of perhaps imagining what happens to this character beyond what's, explicitly covered in the storyline, perhaps from the perspective of imagining this character is a different race or gender or sexual orientation or ability, right? Whatever it might be, the idea is that through co-creation, we're recognizing the ways that we as readers operate autonomously and can create meaning that isn't just specific to what we're being directed to conclude from the text itself. I also want to briefly talk about zines. We aren't looking at zines this week, but I think are helpful as supplements to comics in the sense that, comics and zines are often talked about together, but zines are also kind of medium through which many creators are able to kind of tackle different topics and subject matter through words or visual images that aren't necessarily comic book storytelling. And so I really like the definition offered by Alison Piepmeyer in Girl Zines, Making Media Doing Feminism, in which she writes, zines are quirky, individualized booklets filled with diatribes, reworkings of pop culture iconography, and all variety of personal and political narratives. They are self-produced and anti-corporate. Their production, philosophy, and aesthetic are anti-professional. Most zines are messy, photocopied documents that may contain handwriting, collage art, and even stickers and glitter. Because zines are ephemeral underground publications, it's impossible to determine how many are in circulation. And she kind of goes on to talk about how zines function as a participatory media, a media created by consumers rather than by the corporate culture industries. And as such, despite predictions of their demise in the mid-1990s due to the rise of the internet, they are a part of a continuing trend in late capitalist culture. And in particular, she emphasizes that zines created by girls and women are sites where girls and women construct identities, communities, and explanatory narratives from the materials that comprise their cultural moment: discourses, media representations, ideologies, stereotypes, and even physical detritus. So what Piepmeyer is getting at here is that, similarly to how Chute talks about comics as offering, especially with underground comics, the opportunity where individual people can tell their own stories outside of the restrictions of a press or publishing house that mandates certain stories are told in specific ways. With zines, you're seeing an opportunity for an individual, regardless of access to capital, being able to tell stories or even create some of the calls to action and kind of public educating we talked about earlier in regards to so what and effective argumentation, so long as they have access to materials that could be as simple as copy paper, glue sticks, a photocopier at the library or at home, et cetera, right? It's really the opportunity by which independent publishing can flourish, because you don't necessarily have one or multiple entities in the corporate sphere that are mandating how zines have to look or be created. Zines especially are associated with the Riot Girl movement of the 1990s and the ways that kind of feminist punk bands in particular really utilized the zine medium as a way to educate the public about domestic violence, sexual assault, abortion, body autonomy, and many other topics that were affecting girls and women at that point in time, and of course continue to affect us in this contemporary moment. I've included a video of Sharon Louis de la Cruz, who is a creator who works in both zines and comics. It's a very short video in which she kind of talks about the process of making a zine. I encourage you to watch it because it provides a really nice visual example of what this looks like and the accessibility and kind of ease at which any person could create a zine to tell their own story or to educate the public on something they care about. Okay, making sure that that didn't start automatically playing. And then I also wanted to kind of briefly mention here that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of using comics or using zines, and especially with the text that we're looking at this week, in terms of kind of promoting and distributing these texts via social media, can really be useful to understand through the lens of digital artivism, which Gisela Latorre and Sheila Sandoval talk about in Chicana Chicano Artivism, Judy Baca's digital work with youth of color. And they define digital artivism as a form of political activism that seeks egalitarian alliances and connections across difference. It requires a mode of consciousness that replicates the digital potentialities and egalitarianism of cyberspace. Digital artivism, however, does not blithely ignore the inequalities and oppressions that are also replicated within virtually all forms of technoculture. And so what's important to glean from this definition, and that I kind of encourage you to keep in mind, is that digital artivism is all about producing art and using accessible digital tools to mobilize for social change without ignoring how algorithms and platforms reinforce structural inequalities that impact marginalized communities such as queer folks and people of color. And so with that in mind, it helps us to understand, much like we looked at in week 2, digital tools can be liberatory, but they can also be exclusionary. And so when we're talking about social media as a potential space and generative space where creators can really go to create texts and circulate texts that are meant to kind of promote and convey the types of meaning that we talked about earlier in this lecture. At the same time, we want to be attentive to the ways in which social media also re-perpetuate the kinds of inequities that we see elsewhere in the mediascape, but also within US culture. This brings us to Kay Sohini's article from Women Write About Comics, which I asked you to look at for this week. And Dr. Kay Sohini is a South Asian immigrant and a scholar of comic studies who graduated this semester from Stony Brook University. And the article that I asked you to look at is one that is pretty short in nature, but as I mentioned in my overview lecture, is one that is both kind of addressing a popular audience or kind of a audience outside of academia, as much as it's also engaging with folks who are institutionally affiliated. And so some of what I wanted you to really pay attention to with this article for this week is, I think, well encapsulated by the comic panel that she provides in the article that I've also represented on the right side of the screen here, where in the speech bubbles, she writes, "Who am I writing this for? Who is my audience? If I seek to address people beyond the confines of academia, if I seek to converse with people who share the marginalized position or positions with which my work is predominantly concerned, how can I readjust or tailor my academic discourse to appeal to them?" And so for Kay Sohini, she's really thinking about how does the form that a creator utilizes to convey the content or message of their argument really need to be thoughtful about what is the most efficient way to do so that the most people can be engaged with the work and that the work does not feel totally isolated from or even exclusionary to regular people. There are a couple of points that I think are especially salient in her article, but I think one of the things that I would really like you to kind of reflect on is, in her process of talking about, in her sharing of her personal narrative of the process of writing a graphic dissertation or graphic novel dissertation, she really talks about how that process of utilizing that form and that medium has necessitated that she reflect on what she prioritizes and what's important to her as a creator. But especially, she also notes the fact that in drawing over 100 pages of comics over the last few months, I'm learning through practice that the point of comics is not just to use pictures to illustrate or as supplementary components to simply repeat or even to emphasize the textual elements. So much like Hilary Chu tells us, and I covered at the beginning of this section, right? We don't want to think about the visual component of the comics page as just being redundant, but instead is adding something different to the contribution that's being made by the verbal elements as well. And I really highlight an important takeaway in this blue box here from Kay Sohini's article that I want to come back to at the start of next week in my lecture, but for now I want to really kind of underscore as something I'd like you to really be thinking of in terms of how she talks about the affordances of comics and what she's able to do here that perhaps she couldn't do in an alternate medium. This is going to lead us then into the comics as primary sources for week 3, or the comics that you looked at for class for this week. And kind of, I asked you to really spend some time with by way of various Instagram profiles and artists' personal websites. So the comics creators whose work we read for this week are Tana Tucker, she, her, who's a Black American creator who resides in Oakland, California. Lawrence Lindell, who uses he, they, or Lawrence as their pronouns, and Brina Nunez, they, she. And Lawrence Lindell is a Black American creator from the Bay Area in California. And Brina Nunez is an Afro-Salvadoran Guatemalan creator from the Bay Area in California. We also looked at work by Nes Garza, who uses they, she. And they are a Mexican-American creator from Riverside, California. And we looked at the work of Trinidad Escobar, who uses they, she, and is a Filipina creator from Milpitas, California. All California artists for this week, all kind of in similar areas, but whose work I think cover a nice breadth of things in terms of topics as well as, visual and verbal strategies that we want to be thinking about this week in terms of slice of life storytelling. Now with Lawrence Lindell and Brina Nunez, who are a couple, and their work kind of share the same personal website, I hope that between reading Navigating Mental Health and When Did You Know You Were Afro-Latine, you notice the ways that the kind of setup of the webpage really creates a different reading experience compared to reading Instagram comics by Nes Garza or looking at the carousel posts by Tana Tucker. By that, I mean, I encourage you after listening to this lecture to go back and look at these narratives once again, to think about not only what are the contents covered in these comics, but I also want you to think about the different usages or kind of implied space between the panels. You'll notice with Lawrence Lindell's comic on the left side of the screen that in Navigating Mental Health, we don't have boxes that contain each of the kind of progressions in the narrative. Instead, we have kind of open white space that surround each of the kind of implied panels. Whereas in Brina Nunez's When Did You Know You Were Afro-Latine, we can really see kind of the physical box of the panel represented in terms of kind of thin, what feel like hand-drawn lines. I also hope that you notice between these two comics the ways that they feel very hand-drawn, and that the kind of verbal elements in terms of the narration are really conveyed through a handwriting style that can feel more intimate or personal than if it was sort of typed text, right? And similarly, I hope that you notice kind of, or just kind of start to notice and observe how this written text is situated around kind of the drawings themselves as far as the visual elements of the page go. And so I would really like for you to kind of think about and reflect on, what is your reading experience with navigating mental health, and when did you know you were Afro-Latina? And how does the process of actually seeing or understanding or being reminded that the creator's hand was kind of on the page? We can even see with like the title panel for Brina Nunez is with the hand and the pen, right? How does that perhaps remind us that this narrative that we're reading is kind of hand-drawn or handmade in ways that we wouldn't necessarily get with reading like, you know, some kind of graphic novel or bound comic book that has, you know, typed text as our verbal elements instead of a hand-drawn element. With Nes Garza's Instagram comics that you looked at for this week, and specifically kind of the three that are represented here, I would really like for you to kind of think about and reflect on, how does Nes use the Instagram caption as a way to supplement what is taking place in the comic itself, right? And specifically, I want you to really kind of think about, if we understand from Hilary Chu and from Frederick Luis Aldama, as well as Kay Sohini, that the visual and verbal elements or affordances of comic book storytelling really allow for us to understand that meaning is derived in more salient ways when these two components work together. One of my questions for you this week then is, how does the process of perhaps Nes Garza posting these comics to Instagram change your reading experience compared to reading the comics by Lawrence Lindell and Brina Nunez, who share their work through their personal website, right? How does having the caption, the kind of image-based grid of Instagram, and even the comment section and other components of the Instagram user interface perhaps change your viewing experience? For example, do you find yourself scrolling through the comics at all, or comments at all, when you're reading Nes's comics? Or do you kind of look at the comics and then click away quite quickly? When you're looking at these comics, do you spend a short amount of time reading them, or do you really stay with each of those panels, right? And really noticing, how does my eye move across the screen? As well as, are there aspects of Nes's comics that resemble Brina and Lawrence's approaches of using hand-drawn or handwriting elements that kind of make the comic itself feel or read differently than if you look at a comic book or a graphic novel that have that typed text or some kind of other configuration that perhaps doesn't feel as intimate? And this, of course, is an example of, with Nes Garza's work, we can see how the carousel post on Instagram really affords, in some ways, 4 panels being shared, but the gutter, in terms of that space between those panels, is effectively created through kind of the arrow function on Instagram, as opposed to visually represented as you see on my screen right now, which would be what we would get if perhaps it was printed in a comic strip format instead of posted to Instagram. And I want you to kind of think about, how does the all-at-onceness of seeing these 4 panels in this format as opposed to on Instagram perhaps change what you notice about the narrative versus when you see it on the Instagram interface? Now, you also looked at work by Tana Tucker. And of course, the posts from Tana Tucker are carousel posts on Instagram. And something that's kind of important to note here, and that you'll kind of get especially conveyed through the Instagram captions, is that the works that you are looking at from Tana Tucker are not necessarily comics, but are kind of visual interpretations of, or illustrations of, poetry written by formerly incarcerated youth who wrote the poems that provide the kind of verbal text element of each of the posts that you see represented here. And so what I want you to really be thinking about, and kind of pairing this in your mind with the episodes of Ear Hustle that you looked at or listened to for this week, is, how does Tana Tucker's process of illustrating these poems perhaps change the way that meaning is derived from the poems written by formerly incarcerated youth, when you actually have visuals that supplement what they're conveying through written text? And then here's kind of an example of this, not only in terms of one of the Instagram carousel posts, but also in thinking about how meaning is perhaps derived differently when you see the Instagram caption written by Tana Tucker supplementing the poetry written by the author of this poem, Dee Dee, A Letter to My Body, that you see in the actual image posted to Tana's grid. And then finally, in Trinidad Escobar's posters that are from the same Free Me Fast program that Tana Tucker is illustrating poetry for in the previous slide, I want you to really think about how Trinidad Escobar's process of illustrating these poems by formerly incarcerated youth and kind of having them then be combined with the poetry also changes the meaning making that happens for the audience. I also want you to really think about how these posters being posted to Trinidad Escobar's website, as opposed to being posted to Tana Tucker's Instagram, also changes our reading experience and also creates a kind of similar all at onceness to what Hilary Chute talks about with comics, in that we see the poem all at once, right? And there's sort of no swipe through feature or click through feature like we get with an Instagram carousel post. I also earlier in the Panini interviewed Tana Tucker for the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival, or BCAF, in 2021. I've included our interview here in case you're interested in hearing more from Tana Tucker about her process of illustrating the poems that you're looking at for this week. Unfortunately, the audio and video are not well synced up, and so turning on closed captions can be helpful for clarity when watching if you decide to engage with this as well. All right, so here I'm going to pause really quick before I move into mediated representations of incarceration or life narratives in podcasting. All right, we are finally at the final section of this focused, lengthy lecture of mediated representations of incarceration, life narratives in podcasting. There are a couple things I'd like to kind of tackle in this section, and I'll try to move as quickly as I can, though this is much like the previous section, really important in terms of foundations for our course. So I start with an excerpt from a friend of mine, Percy Jones, specifically his zine titled Collaboration, Coalition Building, and Community Support, and it's forthcoming in a longer zine project. But in it, I think he establishes a really important and useful point of entry for thinking about what it means to engage with narratives about prison, and also in thinking about the kind of stigmas associated so often with creators who are presently or formerly incarcerated. So in it, he provides a key concept for us of kind of thinking about collective collaboration, coalition building, and community support. And he's really thinking about this term of kind of collective liberation as being sort of the umbrella term under which all of these things fall. And so he writes, what is the meaning of it and how do we really accomplish it? It being collective collaboration, coalition building, and community support. So how can we get to the point of it? The road to this is far more complicated and greatly complex than it appears. We have to first set aside being inconsiderate or insensitive to others' conditions. We then have to engage each other, those of us that share a common cause, share the same passions, conscious ideas, moral obligations, fears, concerns for the well-being of others. We have to stop demonizing each other in the name of being self-righteous or to make others look better than we really are, or make ourselves look better than we really are. We are all imperfect, flawed people. We have to respectfully agree to sit down and open our minds, ears, and listen and hear one another. We have to rally around each other, even if we have mental health issues, substance abuse problems, failed marriages, incarcerated loved ones and friends, gay children, straight ones, Black, white, brown people. Now, the reason I start here is because something that Percy does in the course of this writing is offer a kind of framework, especially for thinking about readers who potentially have no contact with the prison industrial complex. Percy Jones himself is a presently incarcerated creator, and in the course of writing his zine is really thinking once again about this process of how does someone who is presently incarcerated communicate and correspond with folks who have never been incarcerated, and also kind of create points of connection or bridges between a readership who perhaps does not have the life experience to match with the topical interest of his zine, yet simultaneously has a lot of contact with the prison system by way of the stigmas and stereotypes and assumptions that they make about the prison system based on the mass media representations they engage with in their day-to-day life. And so the reason why I think in particular this section is important to begin with words from a creator who is presently incarcerated is because some of what I want us to think about for this week is, what does it mean to engage with the question of the prison industrial complex and those most affected by it in the US, especially if we think back to week 2 in our discussions of how, for example, Indigenous folks are overrepresented in the prison industrial complex, much like Black and Latinx communities are. But especially from Percy Jones's perspective with this term of collective liberation, he's providing us with, I think, a very important and useful framework for thinking about how do we acknowledge and address our own biases in actually listening to narratives of and writing by folks who are presently or formerly incarcerated. So for example, for Percy, right, he's talking about the first step to be able to actually do the work necessary to engage with narratives of folks who are presently or formerly incarcerated is to respectfully agree to sit down and open our minds, right? Someone who's not in the position or does not have the capacity or willingness to be able to hear these stories to begin with is not going to be able to actually engage with the thoughtful work that's being done by folks that are on the inside, because those biases are preventing them from being able to actually hear what's being said. Right. And when we talk about these biases, one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to be thinking about the contributions of writers on the inside is because we've talked so far this semester about the ways that stereotypes and underrepresentation and erasure are really harmful to communities such as Asian American and Pacific Islander folks, as well as Indigenous folks. But we haven't talked quite yet about how erasure and stereotype also affects folks who are on the inside of the prison industrial complex, which means that in order for us to do our due diligence as readers of, work that's being thoughtfully done in the United States, and in also acknowledging the massive amounts of our population who are affected by the prison industrial complex, it's necessary for us to also be engaged with the contributions of folks who are on the inside, but whose work may be subject to erasure and kind of a bias that then prevents audiences from really meaningfully engaging. And so I think Percy's kind of first step of this framework of respectfully agreeing to sit down and open our minds is a really important one. Second, he also mentions that we need to be willing to actually listen and hear one another, right? And so acknowledging that without the kind of purposeful attentiveness to hearing what each person is saying, it's going to be impossible to actually be able to have a kind of meaningful dialogue exchange, right? And I think beyond this of kind of being willing to sit down for that kind of conversation and open your mind, as well as being willing to listen and hear, he also points out that we want to really be thinking about how do we rally around each other, regardless of the kind of aspects of one's own identity that perhaps may contribute to the reasons that their story is being erased or silenced in the first place, right? It's important for us to recognize that when we're talking about marginalized populations, whether it's folks who are affected by the prison system, racial or kind of ethno-racial marginalized communities, et cetera, right? Or folks who are marginalized on the basis of any number of kind of aspects of their life experience or identity, we want to also be very thoughtful about the ways in which we are not exclusively listening to folks who have what we interpret or are taught to interpret as being a perfect or blameless story, right? One of the reasons it's so challenging for folks to sort of be willing to listen to the stories of folks who are on the inside is this kind of biased conditioning or perspective that we're given, especially through prison media, right? The stories that we should care about are folks who are associated with law enforcement or associated with the institution or are wrongfully convicted, right? And what's created through that then is this idea that only a select population or a select number of people affected by the prison system are worthy of having their story told. And so this week, when we're thinking about representing the self, I ask you to really challenge some of those biases you may have, whether consciously or not, that may make it challenging for you to kind of listen to and engage with the stories of folks who are affected by the prison system. And I invite you to also think about Percy Jones's words here of what does it mean to rally around each other and not sort of restrict our support or kind of restrict our willingness to be there for each other based on identity factors, right? That perhaps have kind of historically and structurally aided in the kinds of erasure that we're seeing across media that we've talked about thus far. This brings us to Ear Hustle, which is the podcast that you engaged with for this week. And I wanted to just kind of provide for you here the description for Ear Hustle, in which it describes that it brings you the daily realities of life inside prison shared by those living in it and stories from the outside post-incarceration. One of the reasons that I chose to pair Ear Hustle with the comics that you looked at for this week is not only because some of the works in the Free Me Fast posters, for example, are engaging with, what it means for an artist to illustrate the poetry and words of formerly incarcerated youth, but I also really wanted us to kind of think about how the daily realities of life inside prison, as described by Ear Hustle, is kind of very similar topically to the slice of life storytelling we get through comics, right? Whether single panel or multi-panel, I think both comics and podcast episodes have in common this ability to kind of give us a little bit of insight into another person's life. And I think Ear Hustle does this really beautifully in that there's a way in which we can really see kind of the sharing or passing of the mic in the episodes you listen to for this week, offering us a different way of thinking about what it means to engage with someone else's story. And so I wanted to mention that, Ear Hustle was launched in 2017, and it was the first podcast created and produced in prison, featuring stories of the daily realities of life inside California San Quentin State Prison, shared by those living it. This point is especially important of shared by those living it, not speaking on behalf of folks, but instead sharing the mic with folks. Co-founded by Bay Area artist Nigel Poor. You can also see that we're really focusing on kind of the Bay Area as our creators for this week. Co-founded by Bay Area artist Nigel Poor alongside Earlonne Woods and Antoine Williams, who were incarcerated at the time. The podcast now tells stories from both inside prison and from the outside post-incarceration. In 2019, Rasan New York Thomas joined Ear Hustle as a co-host inside of San Quentin. And so for me, one of the things I hope that you kind of noticed and are really paying attention to between the overview lecture and the focus lecture are the ways in which kind of literally and figuratively Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods as hosts are really sharing the mic with other hosts as well as with guests that are in the podcast episodes, both those that you listen to for this week, as well as those that we unfortunately don't have the time to get to because our semester is so accelerated together. I provide some kind of background information on each of the kind of co-hosts, co-producers, and co-creators here. I unfortunately don't have enough time in the course of my lecture to get to all of the specifics here. But I do ask that you look at these biographies to also kind of think about what it means to collaborate in the context of a podcast. But I also want you to kind of think about what does it mean to create or form a solidarity in which multiple creators are collaborating on a project by which multiple voices are heard, but also in thinking about the fact that within the prison system in the US, folks who are on the inside have restricted access to many of the digital tools that we've been talking about thus far this semester in terms of social media. What does it look like for a podcast that's co-hosted by one co-host who's on the outside to be working with folks who are on the inside, and therefore there be kind of a different distribution of access to tools that are then enhanced by or kind of built on by way of this podcast also being promoted on social media. I've also provided 2 videos for you here that provide the kind of context for Earlonne Woods as a creator and also kind of give some insight into kind of the podcast when it initially started, as well as kind of what it developed into once he was on the outside. And I ask that you do watch these 2 interviews because I think that they provide really important and helpful context to just kind of think about, one, what it means to actually see a creator talk about their work, but also I think they well supplement the episodes that we listened to for this week. And this is the second one here. And then finally, I want to kind of wrap up this lecture with sort of talking through some key takeaways from the Don K-Swizzle article on prisons and popular culture, and kind of wrapping up what this means in terms of thinking about the podcast episodes you listened to for this week, and kind of how these key takeaways relate to some of the thematic focus that we've had between weeks 1, 2, and 3. So in prisons and popular culture, there's a couple of key points that Don K-Swizzle makes in terms of thinking about what I term prison media, or kind of media and popular culture in the US that really focuses on prison in some capacity. She's really thinking about what are some of the key trends or patterns that we see over time. So she tells us that prison stereotypes are often furthered as being smug hacks and country club corrections. And these are sort of the dominant portrayals that we're getting in terms of prison media over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. We also have prison film as the most common form of prison imagery that offers a kind of escapist entertainment stories about injustice with an inmate hero that the viewer is encouraged to root for. And there's a kind of exceptionalism that's kind of baked into this portrayal in the sense that it implies that the inmate hero is sort of the one person, or kind of the, not always ideal, but at least the exceptional case in which we should root for someone who's on the inside to make it out, right? She also provides for us, and this kind of mirrors in some ways some of the discussion points from Hilary Chute's work on comics, but Don K-Swizzle provides us with some important historical points in terms of prison media, that in the 1930s, we have the golden age of prison films in Hollywood, during which the core plot is that a man is unjustly sentenced to prison and he must navigate an environment filled with cruel guards and vicious convicts. Oftentimes, these stories also follow a new inmate who serves as the hero of the story. The warden is represented in earlier films as a paternalistic leader of the prison and later as a heartless brute. And the smug hack is going to be the figure who enforces punishment regardless of warden's opinions on the system, right? And so we kind of have these bad actors in the prison system as represented through prison media that are sort of really gluttonous for, punishment and really kind of, in some respects, torturing or sort of violating the prison inmate population. Now, in Golden Age prison films, the hero experiences justice, but the rest of the prison population does not. And there's a way in which this kind of portrayal can satisfy the public in the sense that it's not totally disrupting or abolishing the prison system as it's currently configured, but instead is making some exceptions in which one or a few people are allowed to get out of the prison. In the 1960s, we also see that prison reformation no longer is a dominant theme, and there's instead a transition to portrayals of the population as being hyper-violent. And representations of violence in film are also used to support imprisonment as legitimate in society. And so whereas in the 1930s, we see a kind of prison break emphasis as being kind of the core focus or core thematic interest that's really covered in these prison films. By the 1960s, we really see a movement away from that, and instead a kind of way of implying to the public that we should be rooting for more prisons to be erected, as well as really comfortable with a society that kind of actively profits off of the prison industrial complex. Now, contemporary films now feature prison as a backdrop for other stories and diversifies inmates, which means that more likely in the 21st century, we're going to see prison portrayals in US media culture that show Black and brown folks, that show a kind of background character ensemble that's really populated by many people of color, right, and kind of diverse characters, quote unquote, and that the prison kind of acts as a temporary or perhaps even sustained location or setting for a character to maybe learn something or grow in some way, or oftentimes sort of be in it temporarily before kind of ultimately breaking out. You see this convention in many films, whether it's in kind of the Ocean's 11 franchise, or you also see these kinds of, thematic interests in shows like Ugly Betty. Really a lot of shows that have kind of any kind of elite wealthy character somewhere in the ensemble cast inevitably goes to prison. They're there for an episode or so, and they either break out with the help of that kind of diversified inmate ensemble cast that, Cecil is referencing here, or they get out, or they own the prison if you watch Riverdale. But that's a story for another time. Other important points to cover is that while minorities are overrepresented in the prison population, their stories have been largely absent in films. And so this is incredibly important for us in that, in thinking back to week 2 and the point of Indigenous folks being overrepresented in the prison population, very similarly, Don K-Swizzle is pointing out the fact that people of color and communities of color are overrepresented in the prison population. But when you see a kind of prison media story being told through a television network or a film studio, most of the time it's being told by perspective of a white character. And tropes from the 1930s and 1960s continue to be used throughout contemporary prison media. So even as some of the patterns of the narrative focus of prison media has evolved, we still really see some of the same tropes being used to convey, meaning about members of the prison inmate population. And so she writes that while watching these films, the audience experiences incarceration from the point of view of the new inmate who has been wrongly convicted, received an unfair sentence, or has committed a crime under mitigating circumstances. They can relate to this character. He is in sharp contrast to the other prisoners who are labeled murderers and rapists and depicted as violent monsters who are immoral and unredeemable. And what Cecil is getting at here is that one-dimensional storytelling or one-dimensional character development of members of the prison inmate population in a film or in a television show restricts or reduces the chances that an audience member is going to feel empathy or be able to identify with them, right? However, having a protagonist who's identified or kind of narrativized for us as being exceptional, different, or not like the other prisoners, if you will, is going to then create a kind of narrative impulse for us to actually be willing to root for them, or at the very least be invested enough to watch their story unfold. She also notes that pedagogical tools, riots, and escapes as most noteworthy aspects of prison. Cable TV and the internet make prison media more plentiful, and the 5 types of prison docs include historical, deterrence-based, treatment-based, investigative, and issue-based. And prison admins can restrict media access, and caricatures of prison life are used to sell products. And these are some kind of persistent issues in terms of what prison media contributes to US society. She also points to the fact that both comedies and dramas about prison life depict the daily routine as entertaining and exciting. Prisons are seen as places of nonstop action. In reality, serving time is filled with monotony and boredom. The success of any television program is determined by viewership. Therefore, certain aspects of prison life will not be included. So here's where we can kind of think about things like prison riots, fights between folks on the inside, kind of looming characters that seem really scary or like they're likely to attack another character, et cetera, right? There's a kind of dramatized or overemphasized violence or kind of impulse for violence or potential of violence that's really conveyed through these narratives that allow for the kind of entertainment value, unfortunately, that then is really communicated through prison media. And she also notes that women are underrepresented in prison media, but when visible in texts like Babes Behind Bars films, they're portrayed as hypersexual, damsels in distress, emotional, and hysterical. So whereas men in the prison media genre are portrayed as being hyper violent, hyper aggressive, especially if they are Black men or men of color, we see that women are portrayed as hypersexual or kind of hyper incapable of being able to take care of themselves and unable to regulate their own emotions. And so we see how the extremes are really portrayed in racialized and gendered ways that again further the kinds of entertainment value that prison media intends to kind of serve to the public. I'll just briefly mention, for the sake of time, that I kind of talk about some of the issues of this in an article of mine titled Peripheral Futurities of Multiculturalism, Suffering Latinas and the Orange is the New Black ensemble cast. And what I talk about here is the issue of the fact that, much like Dawn K-Swizzle covers in her own article, that we do see a kind of more diverse ensemble cast so often with prison media. We kind of need to for it to be realistic, given that the prison system is populated more so by or kind of overrepresents people of color compared to white folks. But I also want to note that in shows like Orange is the New Black or other types of prison media that you may be familiar with through streaming platforms like Netflix, I read the kinds of characters in a show like Orange is the New Black who are Black and Latina as being relegated to the status of the white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied protagonist suffering support system, in that their narratives are only deemed kind of most useful or relevant to bring to the forefront when their suffering is then used to kind of advance the main white protagonist storyline in some way. And so the problem or the issue that I take with this then is this idea that only when a character of color can suffer or be made to suffer in ways that are then deemed to be educational and entertaining to the viewing public do we see the stories of Black and Latina characters in prison media being foregrounded temporarily, and ultimately there being a narrative kind of restoration towards the white protagonist by the end of it. And I kind of go on here to say that kind of the issues that I see, for example, in a show like Orange is the New Black is the fact that Black and Latina characters function as a suffering support system to the white protagonist by way of plot twists and multi-episode and season story arcs in which their hopes for a sustainable future are reduced to peripheral futurities that ultimately prioritize the white lead's happy ending. And if this character of color fails to abide by the rules of the periphery, to never encroach upon the central position of the white character or protagonist, they are subjected to expulsion in the form of utter destruction or forced removal from the narrative. By which I mean that in the text that we're looking at for this week, we're really thinking about how does a creator, and in particular a creator of color, self-represent by way of the comics or podcast episodes that they are producing and sharing via social media? And how is it that in situations such as, television or film produced prison media text, do we instead get script writers and producers who are making decisions about how to represent these populations in ways that are not necessarily conducive to advancing the ways that the audience empathizes with them or identifies with them or understands them, but instead upholds, stereotypes and storylines that have really withstood the last century in prison media of being really harmful and limiting and one-dimensional in nature. So that is everything that I have for you this week. I leave you with this terms and conditions checklist that recaps for us the kinds of terms that we've talked about thus far between weeks 1, 2, and 3. My hope is that this week you can really see the points of connection between how the primary and secondary sources are asking you to really challenge perhaps existing biases that you have, as well as really asking you to be thoughtful about how does the medium of a comic or a podcast episode offer the opportunity for slice of life storytelling, or a point of entry or a kind of window into seeing how the creator's own life or an experience of theirs is a possible kind of point of identification or empathizing. Additionally, I hope that you kind of are seeing how the course is really building on itself by way of asking you to consider what are the potential ways in which, telling one's own story, or so kind of using social media in such a way to mediate oneself, as opposed to relying on other infrastructures to do so for you, can create opportunities by which the individual can have some control over their own image, and not have to rely exclusively on other forces to kind of do that representational work on their own behalf. And my hope as well is that this week, in being a much more in-depth week in terms of the type of content we're engaging with, you can really see how the course is moving in the direction of asking you to consider what is the interplay between the content of a text in terms of its messaging and the form, in the sense of how is that message then being conveyed and shared with the reader. Thank you so much if you made it to this point in the lecture. I appreciate you. This is me, K-Swizzle, signing off for your focused lecture for week 3. As always, if you have questions, if you want to talk about any of the things for this class, I'm happy to talk via email, office hours, all of the things, and I wish you the best of luck as you work towards completing your assignments for this week. Bye, everybody.